Well, let's throw it open. Anyone got anything they want to talk about, share today?
Okay. Well, first I want to say thank you for the Law of Jubilee, which was really great, especially right now as we're getting ready to go over to Colombia and Choco. And it just really set us right on a path. We have somewhat of a blueprint, well, not somewhat, that's a good blueprint, of how we are to proceed once we get there and the people we're supposed to talk to. And it's been coming to us not necessarily in
the whole of its entirety.
Yeah, trips to heaven, and that's, it's just been trickling down to us, like in a moment when you're not even thinking about it, God will say something and it's like, oh, okay, and write it down, you know, what you're supposed to do. It's been really wonderful. It became very real and even clearer when we went over that Law of Jubilee that you gave. So thank you for that.
We see one of the first, of course, meeting the people and doing our food banks there, and then establishing relationships with the local, as well as benches, bench of 3 at first. So we really don't know. It's the activities of the bench of 3. What do we do? Do we just talk about what's going on, establish relationships, and some of the, well, we do know that we're going to decree and declare freedom. That's an identity. And connect with them that way. But are there any insights in the process?
Yeah, I mean, if you begin talking about, you know, any sort of governmental structure or whatever, you're going to hit against the prevailing existing view, which in a place like Colombia or Argentina, Brazil, it's an old process. They find it really difficult to get out of the old, because some of it, I think, obviously comes from the Catholic roots, which is sort of a very traditional based thing. So when you bring something new, it really hits up against the old traditional things. And usually they're fairly male orientated groups and quite, you know, and when I went to Brazil, I mean, there were some churches that men and women were separated. They had to sit opposite on the other sides of the church. I mean, it was just like, this was in the Pentecostal church there, AOG, I think it was. And it was just like, whoa, this is really weird. And they're in the midst of revival. You know, I always went over there in '95, and they had these amazing miracles and amazing things going on. And yet they were so legalistic and bound into tradition, whether it be, you know, Pentecostal tradition or whatever. It's still, they're heavily into tradition. So to introduce something, you know, as radical as that it isn't a hierarchy or a top-down structure will be quite a challenge, I would imagine. So some of it is probably demonstrating your willingness to help people hear God for themselves, you know, rather than come out against something which is old. It's probably better to model the new and model, you know, that you help people hear God for themselves, and you engage with them to hear God rather than telling them what God says and that sort of thing. If you have you obviously have a mandate to go, the blueprint really describes what it is you're going to be doing when you're there. And therefore I would, you know, to start with, you know, whatever that is, then outwork that governmentally yourselves before then someone else will then come along. If you try and explain what a bench of 3 is or what heavenly government is, probably they'll struggle initially. Once you've built a relationship with them with love and trust and stuff, then they're much more open to the different things that you're going to be able to unveil to them and help them. So I would, not try and bulldoze anything or try too hard. Just be yourselves and see what comes out of that initially. Because I know how hard it is to change traditional mindsets, and that's even within a church which is thrives on change over the years. It's not easy when change really comes about, and God knows obviously where he's sending you. He knows what the situation is, and he'll have whatever strategy you need to be able to do this. The main thing is live that way yourselves, and other people will find that opens up a realm for them, or questions, or they will see something or experience something which will then lead them into more. And that's always the best way, rather than, coming with some agenda, which, has the changing people's minds as an objective, because it's really hard, to do that. But I'm sure, the blueprint will be unveiled as you need it, bit by bit. That's what happens. It gets unveiled and released, and you find that as you do that, it will open the environment. And if you continually start legislating for the environment from heaven, start calling for an open heaven, start calling for angelic engagement, start calling for those things, you do what you can do, and then heaven will be manifested on earth more and more through you and around you and what you're doing. And I think that in itself will be something that attracts people. You are carrying a sound, you're carrying a frequency that God has given you, and therefore people will resonate with that. Sometimes without even you having to tell them anything, because they'll resonate and they'll want to know, And I think if you legislate and you provide and you govern everything yourselves, then I think God will do the rest in that. Because a lot of people don't really need to know what you're doing. They just need to benefit from it. That's the key in things. You could tell people some of the things that we do, and that would freak them right out. And they would then be put off from experiencing what you're going to open up for them. So if you don't tell them, but they benefit from something, eventually they'll be saying, how do you do this stuff? How are we experiencing this? Why is this happening? But then you can go back and say, well, these are the sorts of things we're doing in preparation for this. We're seated in heavenly places. Well, no one can argue with that from scriptural basis, can they? Because it very clearly says we're seated in heavenly places. They just don't know what they are, and they've never done it. So then you can introduce, well, actually, we discovered that we can actually literally do this. Jesus has been a forerunner. He's opened a door, and we can go into heaven. Because again, if you start talking about going into heaven to a traditional group, whoever they are, potentially they're likely to, struggle, because they'll think you're talking about dying. It's like, because that's the traditional view. You go to heaven when you die. And all that stuff is put off limits by this death view of entering into things after, which we should be having now. It's all put off to the future, isn't it? And put off to heaven rather than now in heaven. So I think it'll be great. I think you'll have great opportunities, and just prepare well for what you're doing in heaven, and then see it outworked on the earth, and then you can follow the journey wherever it's going to take you then. But yeah, a lot of people, I think, going into a different country, into a different environment, they need to learn how to prepare first. Prepare yourselves, but also prepare for the environment that you're going into by having your own open heaven over your lives. That's the key. Then no matter what the atmosphere is there, or what are the difficulties are, you live in that midst of that open heaven environment yourselves. You know, mm.
Do you have any groups or anything over in Colombia that you speak with?
I don't know actually. I'm a bit out of touch with where people are and who they are. You know, it used to be I knew everybody by name, and now because I don't actually deal with all the administrative stuff, I don't really. We may have some people. I'll have a look and see if we've got any connections in Colombia. South America is not an area that we've really had a lot of openings in. I think because of the very traditional nature of it. You know, these things are a little bit outside of a lot of comfort zones, let's say, and it may well be something that is on the way. And maybe you're going to go into there and open up the door for the whole of South America, yeah, and be ambassadors.
Yes.
Into the whole of South America and whatever. You know, we have a few people, but it's not huge numbers. You know, but you know, the Spanish-speaking world, I think, is it the second biggest? Well, maybe the third, but it's certainly pretty high up there in terms of Spanish-speaking people around the world, and therefore, we do have Spanish blogs. So we do have some material translated into Spanish. So that would be useful for you to see. That's on our website. You know, so that you know, it's always good for people to be able to read something in their own language to get them connected. So, you know, by all means, feel free to use that. Yeah. So yeah. So the Law of Jubilee is part of the Engaging God program in the useful documents thing. So there's a whole there's lots and lots of different legislative documents in there that are, you know, available for people to use. What I would encourage people when they do use something like that is to make it your own. Use it as the basis of your own declarations and decrees, as a foundation for the authority that you have to bring Jubilee into situations. So you can bring Jubilee into Colombia, you can bring Jubilee into situations by using the authority it gives you and then, you know, directing it to the specific. They're general things, there are general laws that need to be then applied into specific situations, whether that be our own personal situations, but also into other countries and different things like that. So definitely. Okay, any other things anyone wants to?
Well, Mike, you had talked about when you're in a situation, not necessarily always openly sharing everything that you know, because of the fact that it does, you know, there are a lot of people that would just sort of look at you like a deer in the headlights, like, what? And there would be a certain amount of resistance to that, and understandably, I mean, because I would have been the same way. I can appreciate that. But I have found, like you were talking about, there are things that you can do that will cause things to happen that nobody really has to know what you did, but they get the impact of it. And so we used to be part of an every night Saturday worship thing that went on for years that was wonderful. And then the Lord moved those people away. And so now the whole team, we get together about once every 6 weeks. And come together for an evening of just worship. And so this last time, the team always prays before anything ever happens. And so at that point, I just decided, well, I'm taking everybody up into heaven with me. I didn't say it out loud, but, you know, I just started, you know, legislating how the evening was going to go without saying anything to anybody. Well, it turned out to be a really, really wonderful evening. And even the leader was saying, like, I don't know what happened, but it was just all of a sudden, it was just very, very different, but a lot of very free-flowing worship. Like we basically have a set, but you don't necessarily adhere to it. Yeah. And we would start on the set, and then all of a sudden it would just drift off into just free-form worship, and then it would come back and you'd start again, and it was just doing this all night long, ebb and flow, but worked very perfectly. And at the end, they were, oh, wow, this was so great. And it really was. It was like almost like another level that we went up to. And I just sat there and said, okay. I didn't say anything to anybody about what had happened, but I just said, all right, it definitely does work. And it was very beneficial for everyone there, the ministry that went on afterwards. And so it is true. A lot of times you don't have to say anything. It's just what you bring into the atmosphere or the door that it will open. Like we go to Starbucks on Saturday, and there's a whole core of people that are there. And this one guy who was in earlier is like one of the basketball coaches for one of the girls' teams. And he's a believer coming out of a Baptist background. And it was one of those Saturdays that we really got talking about the Lord, and he was sharing stuff. And we got to share a few things with him that I know were probably a little bit off the grid, but not totally whacked out. But it was something that he really was able to receive. And so you see that you can get these open doors where you can just sort of feed to people to say, hey, there really is a whole lot more. And you really can, interact with God personally, which of course, coming out of a traditional setting, that's not what you normally hear. And you could see the wheels turning in his head. He didn't get really freaked out, but you could see that you had planted a seed that was going to give him something to think about, to say like, that's different. And just let it go with that. And, so we'll just wait to see where that comes from. But there is a lot that you can do that will facilitate an opening that you don't have to force. But once you have it, you can just walk in, plant the seeds, and then, let the Lord bring the increase from there.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it's just being sensitive really to flow and see what's flowing, and always leave people wanting a little bit more than give them too much and they can't cope with it. And I think that is a sensitivity. Sometimes it's really exciting when people are interested, and you just got to be careful you don't overload them with too much, because then, you feed people too much and they end up feeling bloated or sick. Even though it's been good food, you can eat too much of it, can't you? And it is meeting it out in the right sensitive way, because we're not trying to convince someone, we're trying to help them engage God deeper. This isn't a theological argument or a set of doctrines. This is a relationship. And our desire in sharing with people is not to get them to know more, it's to get them to experience more of God's love, his presence, who he is, and themselves, And I think it's always worth, what is the goal? We just did a weekend, which was called Establishing Heavenly Government on Earth. And it was a Saturday and a Sunday, and we had people from around the country, and particularly sort of in our region. And it was very interesting because we set the scene spiritually in terms of what is heavenly government, what are benches of three, basic stuff, what are laws, legislation, what do you do with them? How do you get a mandate and a blueprint? So we set the foundation, and then the next day we went into the practical. Okay, how are you going to get this blueprint that's come out of heaven earthed out onto in the world? It's got to, otherwise what is the point unless it's actually manifesting? And so we really help people to see and ask them three questions. Why are you doing what God has asked you to do? What this mandate, blueprint, why are you doing it? What is it that you're doing, and how are you going to do it? And then we gave them a big, flip chart piece of paper, some sticky Post-it notes. They all broke down into their groups because they came with others, so they weren't on their own. And then it was like, okay, well, let's engage God now and let him clarify this blueprint to you. Let him clarify why, what, and how. And, we went round after about 20 minutes, and people had lots of whats and and some hows. Very few people had any whys. And if you don't know why you're doing something, or you don't know why God's asked you to do something, the obvious answer is, well, I'm doing it because God's told me to, which is a simple thing. Most people didn't even have that in the middle of their diagram. But it was like, okay, think about what is the heart of God behind this. Not only why does he want you to do it, but why does he want you to do it for the results that is got a purpose behind it that's his. And it was quite interesting because it challenged people to look at the motivation that they carried something with. And that then helped them, well, if this is God's purpose, then I want this to be my purpose. You know, I want my heart to be aligned with God's desires, you know, not just pure obedience, because God doesn't want us to be stewards. He wants us to be co-heirs, sons. So there's a degree where we're involved in the why of things and the revelation of that why and his heart and the carrying of his heart and having his heart revealed. When we get, wow, this is hard, then that's something which is the power behind that you keep going, because you know why God wants to do this. You know the people he wants to reach. You know he wants to bless people. You know he's got all these things that are all part of his desire, that gives us that, you know, stickability in that sense. Because whenever you establish something or looking to establish something, you go through the difficulties and the obstacles and the barriers and the things which don't work out the way you think. And sometimes it's easy to be tempted to give up. It's too hard, you know, and it's that why, that heart of God behind something, which really is the key to making sure that we push through if there are obstacles and barriers and remove them and move on and deal with it. You know, so we had a really good weekend. It was I think challenging for some people, but at the end of the day, they all went away with a big piece of paper rolled up with a whole load of sticky notes and stuff, which was a clarity to their blueprint. And now they know that they have something that's come out of heaven for them. Now they can then look for, okay, we need a strategy for this. And we also help them very practically in terms of what are the things you need to think about when you're looking to establish something on earth? Because it isn't just the spiritual. You have to have the practical as well. And there are lots of things to think about, particularly if you're going to engage with people, which is what most of us will do, because that's what most of what God wants to do is engage with people. What's the vehicle you're going to use to engage with people? What is God asking you to establish? You know, what's the best way of doing that? You know, do you need a legal framework? Do you need to operate through an NGO? Do you need to operate through a charity? And what sort of thing that happens? So we did a lot of practical stuff as well in terms of these are all the things it might be useful to think about. You know, do you have what you need in place? If you're going to work with vulnerable adults or children, you need safeguarding things in place. You need all sorts of things. I mean, in this country, we've got a huge thing about general data protection requirements. They're changing all the laws. So everyone has got to have explicit permission to keep anyone's data. So it's so you've got to go and ask everybody that you've got an email address for or data for. If you're an organization, obviously it doesn't apply to personal email things, but you can imagine we've obviously got lots of details on people. Now, those who signed up specifically, obviously they've given you permission because they've signed up for something. But there's a lot of things where people have historic details and things like that, that now you've got to go and look at what do you do with that? You know, so I've had like 3 or 4 phone calls from different charities I've been involved in the past or we've contributed to and whatever, saying, you know, do you mind if we still keep your records and do you mind if we contact you? And some people are sending emails out to do that. But if you don't have those things in place, you can run foul of the law effectively. So it isn't just about, you know, spiritual things. It's also about being righteous and doing things righteously and making sure you've got the right vehicle. And if you don't set things up properly at the beginning, you can run into all sorts of problems later on. And I was talking to someone the other day who's quite a well-known person, you probably know him, and they set up a charity and they were out working their ministry in this charity, and then they started to go into the direction that we're in now. And the people they set the charity up with, the trustees, promised that they would always be there to support them in their ministry. But as soon as they started to go down this direction, they basically kicked them out of their own charity. So they set this charity up, and now they were being evicted from it, and they could no longer use it. Now, after a couple of years, the thing folded up because the people who carried on didn't have the mandate to do it. But you can imagine how difficult that must be, how feelings of betrayal, and how much must you feel when you've done this and God's given you this and you've established this to do it, and then all of a sudden you're voted out of it. So there are certain things that when you establish something new, you've got to get it right at the beginning, and it's worth spending the time, A, to establish the relational foundations before you build on them, and B, to make sure that the spiritual and the legal tie up. Because again, we have charities, big charities, who started out by Christians operating in a very Christian way, who are now not even mentioning God because they're sort of drifted away from that, because people have come in, and because the original ethos wasn't guarded within the Constitution or within whatever they set up, and then it ends up, doing a function, but actually God not getting any glory for it, And so I think in that, is a important thing, no matter what we're doing, to make sure we've got the right foundations, in all sense of that word. Because if you're going to build, Jesus made it clear, build on the rock, build on something stable and secure like the rock, and the whole thing of things do get shaken. And, Hebrews says the only thing that's really going to remain is things which is established on the kingdom, so it's important to spend some time. And this was a great weekend to allow the people to spend the time considering, have they thought about this? Have they thought about that? Because I think there was probably like 25, 27 people there from different areas in our region and different parts of the country, who all have a desire to do something that God's calling them to do, but none of them are actually doing it yet. And so it was like, how do we help you get this from heaven onto the earth, established, healthy, growing, fulfilling God's purpose? And it takes a little bit of preparation in everything to make sure that you're getting ready and you're right to start operating in that. So the why of what we're doing is really important, because when someone says, why you're doing this, well, God told me to, is probably not enough to convince them of what you're doing. And I think Habakkuk 2:2 says, write the vision and make it plain. Then people can run with it. And if we can't explain what our blueprint is in a couple of sentences, how would we hopefully be anyone else to understand it? So clarifying, even for ourselves, what is it that God's called us to do? Why has he called us to do this? What's the heart of it? What do I carry in this? Can I explain this to people in such a way that they will get it? I think it's a really helpful process to go through, no matter what we're doing in life. Sometimes reviewing things is very helpful, because you can look at where you were, where you are, and where you're going to be in a light of making sure everything's in place. And I think, about 6 months ago here, God said to us, review everything with the lens of the new and see if everything you're doing is a reflection of new rather than old. And it was really quite an interesting exercise, and asking people to just review what they were doing, why they were doing it, how they were doing it, in light of new revelation, heavenly revelation perspectives, And we realized that not everything was functioning on the same basis, which gave us the opportunity of revisiting it and relooking at it. So, yeah.
I just wanted to share an experience that I had. It was really, really pretty good. I have a set meeting place where I meet with God, and it's 3 waterfalls that came down into like a river, and then I am seated on like a big marble slab that comes out over the river with a gold wall and gold bench. And recently, it got changed on me. I didn't change it. I went there, and the three waterfalls that used to come down into the river, when I looked over the wall, I knew something was different. And I looked over the wall, and the water did not just end in this river anymore. It just kept going all the way down, and I couldn't see at all where it ended. It was just powerful. The water was just all the way down. You could see the mist coming up and all of that, but the water did not, there was no end to it. There was no river like catching it and pooling around me any longer. It was just going all the way down. And I was like, this is not the way it's supposed to look. And I tried to get the other look back into my mind, and I couldn't even do it. So now my whole thing changed.
Yeah.
And it was really, really powerful. And I was telling James, I was like, God changed my scenery.
Well, our seats of government increase in authority. There's no end to the increase of his government. So often things like that are symbolic of God showing you, hey, don't get comfortable here because there's always something deeper. I've got something further for you to go into. And obviously this is an illustration of that. Three nice little rivers and waterfalls, and now, whoa, where's this go? Now, if you're really brave, jump off and see where it goes. Because I did that. I mean, I when I first went before the judgment seat with my scroll, I came out of this judgment seat, and the spirit of the fear of the Lord took me to a waterfall that was going so deep I couldn't see the bottom. Very, very similar to what you're describing. And I'm standing on the top, and I feel that I need to jump off. So I'm thinking, whoa, this is, I can't even see the bottom. So it was like, okay, but do I trust? So I jumped off, and I floated down and down and down, and I ended up in the Father's garden. And I ended up in the place where this deep pool is in the Father's garden. That was the first real encounter I had with the Father's garden. And I discovered there are other ways of getting there. You can follow the river of life and things. But this was the first thing. And it was after a really powerful encounter with the fire that now I was asked to go deeper. Because what the fire had done in me had prepared me for being able to engage the Father in that way. Because before I wasn't able to. And sometimes things change because now something's happened in you that's prepared you for something more. And then you've got to go with it. So next time you go back there, jump in, go with it, go deeper, because deep's calling to deep at the sound of his waterfall. And he's just drawing you into the depths. And I eventually, I found that engaging that pool in that Father's garden took me into some amazing revelatory encounters of truth, his thoughts about me. It then took me on because I was used to going down there to this chest and these golden coins, and I would take and eat the coin. It was amazing. And then one day I was going down, and it like, well, this isn't the bottom. That's what it was. This isn't the bottom. I thought this was the bottom, and it wasn't. And I went on beyond the bottom, and I ended up in a tunnel, and I ended up back into the Father's heart in eternity from the same place. So it really took me way, way beyond my previous experience, or even what I thought possible. Why didn't I see that the first 10 times I went there? Because I wasn't in a position to be able to. And then this time, whatever's happened in my life had prepared me for, now you can enter into a different dimension, a different realm of this. And so we've got to expect that. Don't get comfortable. Don't get comfortable with how something is and expect it always to be the same, because God is also creative. and he wants us to see that creativity. You know, so it's like, well done, good and faithful servant. You've done well here, but now come over here because there's more. Awesome. Sounds great.
Well, I seem to be going through experiences of being willing to go somewhere. For instance, it would be the best way to explain it. One of the ones that I had is that, you know, stepped into heaven, saw the door, walked through the door, and everything inside was totally black. And as soon as I stepped inside, the door closed behind me. And of course, there was no light, so I couldn't see anything. And the Lord just said, okay, start walking. And so it's like, okay, I have no idea if there's a floor under me. I don't have any idea what is around me, but just walk. And so I walked for a short period of time, and he said, okay, now turn around and come back. And I did. And so I was trying to gauge in terms of, okay, like I know how many steps I took once I came in. Somewhere around here, there's going to have to be this wall. So I'm sort of like inching my way forward, thinking, okay, I don't want to slam right into the wall. And the next thing I knew, I literally walked through the wall, and I was back where I started from. Mm-hmm. And I was like, okay, what was this about? And so I was, talking to the Lord about it. And the thing was that even though it was totally dark, which there's a, I don't know if you have it over there, but there's a thing it's in certain places over here where you're given the opportunity to know what it's like to be blind. And so you go through the scenario, it is completely dark. You know, they are watching you because they say, look, if you freak out, we can watch you, we will come and get you. So we did it one time. And the first time we went in, and when they initially cut out all the lights, I mean, you couldn't have your cell phone, you couldn't have a digital watch. The total blackness, I really started to panic, and I was ready to say, come get me out of here. But I thought, no. And then after I got used to it, I was fine. And you got accustomed to having to feel and having to listen. So as I was going through this, I was like, okay, Lord, I'm in you. So I know I'm in a safe place. So even though I can't see and I have no sense of where I'm walking, no sense of anything around me, because I'm in you and this is where you've told me to go, then I can trust that it doesn't matter, I'm going to be fine. And so then last night he had me do it in the exact opposite, where it was total light. And I still couldn't see anything. Yeah. But I had to keep walking. And so I was just talking to him. I said, now, why is it? I said that in the light, you feel a whole lot more comfortable than in the dark, even though the situation really is identical. You have no idea where you're going, but one is just more comfortable than the other. But I really, for me, it's really more of like being willing to like, can you do this and walk through when I tell you to go, you don't know where you're going, you don't know what you're doing in the sense of everything is new. There aren't any landmarks you can work with, but when I tell you to go, are you willing to take those steps? Even though you're really on very unfamiliar territory, there isn't anything in your senses that can guide you as to what you're doing. You just have to trust that because you're in me and you're moving, everything is going to be okay. And so that was really interesting because the fact is, being in the dark, I just got to the point like, okay, I don't have anything to be afraid. I don't understand it. And this is weird, but I don't have to be afraid, even though I can't see.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, God hides himself in a dark cloud. So we have to go through the darkness of the cloud to get to him quite often. And it is about trust. You know, the trust is the key issue. You know, it's easy to trust God when everything seems okay and it's all there and you understand everything and everything's all mapped out. But when you don't, and when you can't see, and when you don't, where are you then? And of course, God doesn't want us to be in a place where we can't see, but sometimes he has to take us through the place where we can't see so that we will develop that trust. And we won't be leaning to our own understanding all the time of everything. So for me, that was a very specific period where he did test me through that. And it wasn't just having an encounter in a dark cloud. It was, I'm living in a dark cloud because I can't see anything anymore. You know, I can't hear, I can't see. He's not speaking to me, you know, other than, you know, yeah, be still. You know, that was the first thing, be still. You know, be still. You know, well, it was great being still before I was told to be still, because I couldn't see in that being still, and I didn't know what he was doing. I needed to know. And for me, that was where the trust came. Do you trust me when you do not know? And do you need to trust me or you won't know? You know, it's almost like, if you have to trust me, you know, and if you're sort of saying, well, I only trust you when I know what you're doing, then that isn't real trust. You know, and so God really took me through that. In fact, you know, we've got this intensive here next week called Into the Dark Cloud. You know, and the whole thing is about helping people through a journey of essentially discovering their soul's place in regard to their spirit and God. And do they trust? You know, do they actually, are they separated, soul and spirit? Or are they still living under the authority of the soul? You know, is the soul in control? Because the soul needs to know. You know, that's the soul's thing. You know, I need to be safe and secure, because we have this survival instinct, don't we? We have these coping mechanisms, things to keep us safe. And you know, normally you don't walk into a dark place that you don't know where you are because it isn't safe. And your soul would be flagging up all sorts of potential things. You know, and some people do get, you know, fight or flight things. You know, adrenaline starts pumping. You know, even your physical body can be like, whoa, where am I? You know, and I think for all of us, we've got to get to that point where we trust God when we don't see anything, when we don't know anything, but we trust him implicitly because he's God, he's our dad, you know, and therefore going through some things, this is difficult, but this is not a reflection on God doesn't like me or God is punishing me. God is walking me through this. I might not be aware of him always, but he's there. And even as you say, he's in us and we're in him. So everything we experience is, you know, in him we live and move and have our being. We exist, you know. So everything's that, but the soul needs sometimes the assurance of being able to see, you know. And I think all of us will have to go through that at some point in our life to have our soul and spirit separated so that the soul is not independent. For me, it was definitely an independence of the soul that God was dealing with. For other people, it may be different things, and people may call their experiences different things or may share them in different ways, but they're all really pointing to the same thing. God wants to bring us to that point where he can entrust us with everything he wants to entrust us. Because he trusts us and we trust him, that when he gives us something, we embrace it. And we may not need to understand everything. And I think you guys going to Colombia, you know, it must be all sorts of things around that, which are, whoa, you know, but then you say, no, God is with us. God has sent us. We're going with him. We know this is what God wants us to do. And that's the trust that comes in. Do we have all the answers? Is everything figured out? No, I'm sure it isn't, but there's that trust. I know that I'm walking this out with God. You know, for me, that really was a challenging scenario. And I had to really surrender. You know, and I'd said I surrender all. I don't know how many times in my life. You know, all to Jesus I surrender all. And it's just like, oh, what about this next bit that I didn't realize that I had to surrender? Because you can only surrender what you know. That's the reality. When I say all, it's all that I know. And my desire is for all. But how do you know you're going to surrender that until it actually comes to the point where God's asking you to surrender this or this or this? And so it's always it's a sense where our desire might be, but until we actually get to the point of letting go or something, you don't know, you know. And you know, all my dreams and visions and all the things that I had expectations of, I had to let go. And it wasn't one of those flippant, stick it on the altar, but yeah, I can pick it up later, because I don't know how many times I've heard people say that. I laid it down on the altar, but did you? Or did it die on the altar? Or was it just placed there temporarily because you thought that was the right thing to do? My things died, literally. It was such a death that it was like they were never, ever, ever going to happen. And I went through the emotions of if they never, never, never happened. And I faced the emotions and they really did die. And that was the point where I was no longer operating in what I was doing, but I could just be. And if none of these ever got fulfilled, I knew that didn't change my relationship with God or the love that I felt for him and he felt for me. I knew it didn't. But before that, I couldn't have possibly said that. And in all the different engagements I'd had with fire in one sense, and purification and refining, this was the deepest thing. This dealt with me at a core level, and the core being of who God made me to be, I now surrendered. And that opened up way, way, way beyond what I could have imagined or thought. And God was always wanting me to get to this point where he could trust me and unveil things and reveal things. He just couldn't, because I would have used it. I would have used it to maintain my identity in independence. Even though they were all things that God was wanting me to do, I was using it, and when I stopped using it, that made him free to unveil it more and more and more, So the last sort of 6 years have been a continual unveiling of things that I were beyond my even imagination to think about, because I got to the point where I didn't need to know. He was then free to show me. And for everyone, I guess their situations are different, but it does come down to the trust issue. Do we really trust God? And you don't really know until you have to trust him. This is the reality of it. When I had 2 years in heaven every day with amazing revelation every day, well, of course I trust God. This is amazing. And then it's like, oh, well, now you're not going to see anything. You're not going to go in heaven. You're not going to do anything. Now, how do you feel? And for me, I really struggled with that. It was a real battle, because my soul didn't give up without a fight. I wanted to know. I demanded to know. It's my right to know. That's what my soul was basically saying. And to God, I was demanding my rights before God. It's not a really sensible thing to do, really. But that was the level of my soul. So, why are you doing this? I want to know. And I'm not cooperating, basically. I mean, if I really thought about it and knew really what he was doing before he was doing, it wouldn't have had the same effect, because I would have known, and that would have counteracted the fact that I had to not know and deal with it. So for me, it was like dark, black, and it wasn't a pleasant experience, but it was a very positive outworking and result, because it exposed what I'm really like, soul-wise, without the influence of the spirit and in my spirit. I was totally exhibiting my need for independence from what I'm doing. So huge challenge it was, but now next week I'm taking a whole group of people through it in 3 days. It really is going to be an intensive. Lots of ministry opportunity for God to be at work at the core into people's being, so they can end up going through that black cloud into the very presence and person of God in a totally different level, because he wants to unveil himself, but he hides himself in there to protect us, because you don't want to go into his person carrying all that stuff. Once, and even when I did go through that cloud and see him, it was such an overwhelming experience looking at one little facet. That was the key to the expansion of my mind, really, because then that then enabled God to reveal himself more and more and more and more. You know, just one facet was enough to completely challenge my thing of how could I possibly understand and know God, you know, who's infinite. You know, that was the sort of the infiniteness of God was revealed as I looked into his face. And I realized at that point, I remember Ian Clayton talking about, you know, talking to the spirit of knowledge and saying, I want knowledge. I want to know everything. And he picked up a blade of grass, and it was like there was more knowledge in the blade of grass than he could possibly contain. And he had to drop it because it just totally exploded his mind. You know, and I think, you know, this was the first of many occasions where that's happened to me, that's just challenged me such a way, which has been part of the renewal process of, you know, trusting him, knowing him at a deeper level, trusting him at a deeper level, knowing him at a deeper level, and trusting him at a deeper, because each time you've got to choose. It's not automatic. It's a choice. Now, because when I started to go through this cognitive dissonance, I had choices all the time. You're gonna accept this is God? God? Me? Well, no, it doesn't compute. Does not compute, does not compute. And I just kept having this doesn't compute. So, okay, but are you going to trust me? You know, are you going to believe this is me? You know, I'm actually trying to show you what I'm really like. So what you thought I'm like is going to be a challenge anymore. And over, you know, I went through this process, which I think was kick-started by seeing the face of God and just realizing how many facets there are and how amazing it is. I think was the thing that shook my belief that I know God, you know, because I know quite a lot of stuff, and I guess I thought, oh, wow, I know a lot about God, and this was just like, you know nothing, you know nothing, yeah, you know. But to accept that was difficult for my soul, because my soul was based in identity in knowing, and when you have to face that you don't know, you have to come face to face with the reality that your soul is not all powerful. And you're never going to know in the power of the soul outside of the relationship through the spirit. You know, it's never going to be independent or through independence. Yeah. So, yeah, I think we're going to have some fun next week. And we're going to culminate with a marriage ceremony with people writing their own vows to God. Not that they know that yet, but...
I vow to never say that I know it all anymore because I don't. Oh man, I wish I could be there for that. But the one thing that happened was with this whole encounter with going through the dark room. I think it was like a couple days later, he had me in the spirit go to pray for someone, and I won't go into all the details. But the way that I had to go to get there, even though it was through a very, very uncomfortable process. But having walked through the dark to say, okay, I know you can do this and you don't have to be afraid, then going through this process was like, in the natural, this would make you want to freak out. But because I know that he's there with me, then even though this looks like a very disastrous situation, I don't have to worry. I just have to sit there and rest and listen to, okay, how do I do this? And the whole answer was wiggle your toes. And that was the thing that opened it up and made me be able to move to another area. But it was something as simple as that. But it was like, in the natural, if that had happened to me, it would have been a very, very unpleasant and potentially lethal situation. But it was the whole thing like, okay, you can go into something, you don't really know what it is, but as long as you trust and you know that you're there because he put you there, he'll show you what to do. Don't freak out. And so going through the dark, just that little exercise made all the difference. Going through the encounter where I needed to get to be able to minister to someone in the spirit, it was absolutely necessary, and made the whole thing, okay, you know, in the natural, would I want to do this? No, but I don't have to worry about it because I know that you know, you've got this under control. I'll just listen. You'll tell me what to do. This will all work out. Yeah. So
awesome. Yeah. I mean, I think every experience I've ever gone through to bring me into a greater level of maturity has been uncomfortable. it's just all of them have felt uncomfortable because they're stretching, aren't they? They're sort of expanding. You know, you don't get big muscles without tearing your muscles. Actually, every time you go, if you're a weightlifter or a bodybuilder, you basically tear your muscles and they grow bigger and stronger. So every time you're doing that exercise, there is this, it feels like I'm tearing my muscles here. Well, the reality is we're actually being stretched and pulled and tested in a sense. And it's always been uncomfortable. Now, hopefully other people will find it easier just to surrender and recognize be proactive about this and pursue it. I couldn't pursue it. That was the thing. If I'd know to try and pursue it, it would have short-circuited the process because knowing was my issue. So he had to take me through. I am not going to tell you what this is for. I'm not going to tell you anything about this, basically. So that I learned to trust and I was stretched, but that did prepare. It's always a purpose in God in this, and it's always for our benefit and our good. I think that's the good. God wants to work all these things together to bring good out of it all for everybody. Although it doesn't feel like it at the time. The Hebrews 12, discipline does not feel good at the time. Now that doesn't mean that because it's punishment and we're being beaten, it's a challenge. It's a challenge to the soul. Are you going to surrender? Are you going to do it your own way? Here's some correction and some direction. Well, yeah, but I don't want to do it that way. I'd rather do it this way. I know how to do it this way. Yeah, but you can't do it that way anymore. And some people, they are those that will always want to do it their own way. And you can say, here's something, try this. And they'll go and try to do it another way. And I'm not saying that there aren't many other ways, but it's the attitude that you come into something which is the key. And I certainly had a wrong attitude into it, because it was an expression of my soul's knowledge, really. And that had to end, and it ended not in 2012, but it then opened up a whole 6 years of continual change and transformation, and deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper. And at each level, there was always a challenge. Are you going to trust me? No. Are you even going to trust this? This is me. Because sometimes it's like, get behind me, Satan. And it's God.
Well, I remember Dr. O said the first time that Jesus showed up as a white man to him, it was like, I don't think so, Lord, because he had always seen him as black. And it was like, I don't like this version of Jesus. Can we go back to what you were before? And so the Lord took him through a whole thing of like different races. But he said, and he goes, but it was through the process that he realized that God does not have a race. He is whatever, but he said it was a real struggle for him. And he really, like the whole get thee behind me saying, like, I don't want to deal with you because you don't look like the way I think you should.
Yeah, and reality, Jesus wasn't Jewish either. Yeah, he certainly wasn't English or American, that's for sure.
You mean he didn't speak the King James English?
Like some people he didn't, no.
Oh, because I've heard people say that was good enough for him, so it's good enough for them. I mean, that's a real change.
Yeah. Oh dear, we have such funny ideas, don't we, about God and about Jesus sometimes,
He must laugh continually. We must be a constant source of amusement.
Yes.
In a good sense, to say, where did they come up with this one?
Oh, absolutely. I think there's a really wonderful picture. I can't. It's like a lion with this paw over its eyes, sort of got like, oh, what are they doing now? You can just imagine Jesus there. It's like, oh, what are they up to? Yeah. But we do have some funny ideas. It's like when you see all the films made about Jesus's life, how many of them? There's Jesus there as the, handsome, blue-eyed, blonde, haloed person. Oh dear. But those are the things which, when we get to know him, they all start falling away, don't they? All those, and you have to laugh sometimes at what you used to think.
Well, I can remember being when we were kids in Catholic school, and for some reason, we got we used to get what were called holy cards. I don't know if you've ever seen them. There was sort of like maybe Catholic trading cards of saints and Jesus, stuff like that, for lack of a better word. And it was usually for a special occasion. Well, for some reason, our school got some from a missionary over in China, Japan, or whatever. And it was, the Madonna with child, and they were Asian. And I looked at it and said, well, this isn't Jesus. Why does this card look like that? And it was, to me, I mean, I was a little kid, but I was like, well, Jesus isn't Oriental. He looks like me.
Yeah.
I can remember taking it home to my parents and saying, I can't believe that they did this. And fortunately, they both had the sensitivity to say, wait a minute, that's to help people in that culture understand. They won't understand it. I mean, as a kid, I still didn't get it, because, I mean, Jesus, of course, looked like an American. How could it be anything else but an American? And I understand what they were trying to tell me, but I had a really hard time saying, well, why don't they just show him what he really looks like, and stop all this. But that was such a shock, was that, well, why would you ever portray him as something other than the blonde-haired, blue-eyed, North American, English-speaking person?
Oh,
but it really is true. We do have these conceptions of what he's like, and he's not like anything like that at all. And we have to be willing to say totally different.
Yeah, I remember years ago they brought out a set of videos on the book of Matthew, and in that Jesus was just always laughing and always smiling, and it was just like, wow, this is amazing. I mean, it was such a challenge at the time, but so wonderful to see human. Jesus was so human in a sense, and he was real, and he wasn't floating around in all the time, and it felt like that. And in one sense, it's obviously Jesus has to identify with everybody if he's going to be able to connect to everybody. So yes, Jesus can appear to look like this, and this, because he's identified with all of us, identified into the depth of who we are in our identity, our fallen identity, which does latch onto race and color and identifying with our group, whether it be our nation or our country or our gang or our tribe. That's something which we identify with, don't we? And we then, often the people live in their ghetto of that because they've never really discovered their security in themselves. They just now I'm secure in this group. And obviously Jesus relates to all those groups, so he can set us free from needing to be part of all those groups and being in him. So our identity, he identified with our brokenness, and that includes our need for a gang, basically, that's like us, who agree with us. Unfortunately, a lot of the religious institution didn't get the message, and we got 30,000 gangs, all basically saying you can belong here if you agree with everything we belong to and agree to, and as long as you agree, you'll be welcome here. And then again, conformity to something other than the reality of Jesus. And Jesus wants to bring blessing to every family of the earth, and he has identified with every family of the earth to actually bring that family into security in him, not in any other outside things. And a lot of people feel secure because they're part of the US or part of something that's, we're big and strong and we've got all this stuff, therefore, I'm pretty secure. And I think that was why 9/11 and things like that were such a sea change to people's security, and the fear that came out of that we're not safe in our own country was a huge inducement to fear. And obviously, what went on as a result of how they treated Muslims and things after that, tarring everybody with that brush, and therefore, because they're now afraid of everyone who's got a turban or, who has a particular look, and again, that just highlights where people are in this whole process and journey with it. And I think, a lot of Christians aren't any different, hence the, Christians who are part of the Ku Klux Klan and other things. I mean, it's just, bizarre to think of it, but, and Christians who, were advocating slavery and using the Bible to prove it,
Well, it's interesting. I was just about a week or so ago, I was watching PBS did a whole thing about Africa, and it was fascinating in terms of the kingdoms that were in Africa, stuff that we never learned about for whatever reason. Of course, we didn't do a whole lot of world history in Catholic school. But one of the things that really struck me is that there were 2 African kings who were Christians and who were actively involved in the slave trade. Because as long as it was somebody that I conquered and it was a very profitable business, they were willing to make money. And there was even a Muslim guy who, did the same thing. So it was, equal opportunity. But yeah, the same thing is like you see that and it's like, wow, they were believers, and yet there was an area of blindness in their life, which happens to all of us, where we can very easily disregard people that are different than ourselves. And even though we may know and love the Lord, we can fall into that trap and make that mistake and just say, well, this person, they're not my group. So because they're not my group, yeah, I can do whatever. I can treat them however.
Yeah.
And that was just really sort of a surprise. I mean, I knew that there were parts of that slave trade, but to find out that 2 of these guys were actual believers and yet participated in it, didn't see anything wrong with it. And it was like, boy, how dumb can we be?
Absolutely. Yeah, totally. Because essentially they were, A, as you say, taking advantage, but B, they were using a totally warped view of God and the Bible to actually prove that. And I think that's the danger of taking, you can make the Bible virtually prove anything. If you want it, you'll find some scripture or something somewhere that will give you warrant to do whatever you want, one way or another, from being polygamous to anything else. I mean, it's all in there, and therefore that's okay for Abraham. And he was supposed to bless all the families of the earth, so we should all be polygamists. I mean, it's not really taking into account, okay, well, what did God really say, rather than what have all these people done thinking that they were doing what God said. But we do run into problems when we don't know him personally. That's the reality of this. Jesus identifies with all people groups so that he can meet them personally and they will feel welcome and part and whole. And I think that's why he appeared, as a black Jesus to Dr. O, because actually that's acceptance, isn't it? But then he obviously challenges the presumptions by then turning as a white Jesus or whatever color shade he was. It must have been a real shock. Yeah, when you're saying it, it's just like.
Oh, to hear him tell the story, and of course he laughs about it now, but he said he was really angry at first and was like, how dare you do this? This is not my understanding of you, and I'm not comfortable with this. But he said that was one of the things that the Lord did with him, to let him say, hey, you are biased and you are prejudiced like everyone is. Yeah. And so by encountering Jesus as a different, as a Hispanic, as an Oriental, as a whatever, was a thing that the Lord really used with him to get him to say, get over it. Yeah. I'm not locked into this little box that you think I am. And I think that's something we all have to deal with.
Well, we do, because we've all got those views. That's what he's doing in deconstructing and renewing and the mind, dealing with all those little things, which are ways of thinking, which are completely out of sync with the reality of who he is in that way. And there are lots of little things like that. Some of them are little and some of them are big. And it's wonderful that he will take the time to walk us through that process to reveal truth and bring us into truth and unveil the truth in a way that we can receive it, even though sometimes it's somewhat challenging. he does it in a way that it is possible for us to receive it. You know, I mean, I would have been shocked if Jesus had appeared to me as a black person. When years ago, I would have been like, well, that's not who he is. You know, not that I ever thought he was North American and white, but, you know, I wouldn't have put him as an African American or an African or any other thing. It would have been, well, yeah, I guess he's sort of a little bit like Jewish, I guess, you know, but I never really thought about it like that, you know, because you sort of don't, I guess. But I would have been severely challenged if he had appeared that. And I would have probably thought, that's not you. You know, this isn't real. This can't be real because that can't be you. You know, and when Jesus appeared to me in different ways, it was a huge challenge. And he was deliberately doing that to break my preconceptions of what things are for them to be real. And I think he does that with us all the time. He's trying to break down those preconceptions so that we're open to everything that he has for us. Because if we don't, we'll be limited, because we won't be able to accept this as truth, because it isn't possible, because it doesn't fit in with my version of truth. You know, I don't have a version of truth. There is the truth, or there isn't the truth. And you know, my version of it doesn't cut it. It's like, it's either true or it isn't. And some of my versions definitely weren't, even though I thought they were. You know, and that's what everyone's like, isn't it? We all think those things are true, but now we'll get a little bit of shaking and a little bit challenging, and all of a sudden we realize how much I'd presumed and assumed that I thought I knew and understood, and how much I didn't. And the wonderful thing is, there's God smiling, saying, hey, look at all this stuff.
Yeah. Often on a couple of occasions, I've had dreams where I'm pushing a basket. I'm very uncomfortable with that, really, because I want to know what's in it. I don't think what's in it is really good. Maybe mindsets, that kind of thing. But the movie The Shack really sort of demystifies a little bit of that.
Yeah. Well, I think, yeah, the Shack itself, I think, was something God really inspired to change the mindsets of a generation, really. You know, and I think, you know, that stuff needs to be continually outworked to challenge, you know, the wrong views of God and our own expectation of him. And I think there's a lot more of that to be done. I don't know if you've seen the movie on Netflix, Come Sunday. I'd encourage you to see it. It's only just come out. It's the story of Carlton Pearson, Bishop Carlton Pearson, and his being excluded from the Pentecostal movement because he discovered there wasn't a hell. It's a really interesting story of what he went through and how he faced, you know, being expelled from his own congregation and people leaving. It was heartbreaking in some senses, but a real story. It was a real story, obviously. You know, it's got Oral Roberts in there trying to convince him that he's a heretic, and you know, and eventually, you know, having his own stuff in his own life with his son and various things. Very, very genuinely done production. Good people in it too. It's good, some good actors in it. Martin Sheen plays Oral Roberts, stuff. But it's on Netflix. It's called Come Sunday. Well worth a look. Because what it is, it's about how God spoke to. I mean, he was watching the TV I think it must have been early 2000s, possibly, and he was seeing the genocide that was in Rwanda and all these people dying. And you know, he was a preacher of hellfire stuff, and he sort of asked God, you know, how is it fair that this is going on? And God said to him, it isn't. They're not going to hell. So, and he was just like, God, I mean, literally God spoke to him. And of course, then he has to defend. Well, God couldn't speak to you. That couldn't have been God, because there is, and blah, blah, blah. And there are all these people trying to convince him, because he was one of the leading lights in the Pentecostal movement. You know, and then for God to speak to him, You know, it was a really, and I think for me, it felt, yeah, a lot of people are going through this where God is speaking to them and so challenging what they believe. But when you know it's God, you're in a total rock and a hard place, because what are you going to do when you know it's God, but other people are telling you it isn't God, and they're trying to convince you that everything isn't God, and you know it is, you know, and give him his due. He stood firm in spite of going from, you know, 10,000 or 5,000 people down to couldn't even afford to be in the building, you know, to, you know, being excommunicated from the African American, whatever the bishops or whatever they call them in those days. You know, it was like he went through it, and because he knew that's what God said to him, and he all the way through it, well, how can I deny God? And they're all convincing him that he's, you know, lost the plot, and, you know, he's obviously listening to the enemy, and that's what they were saying. Well, you've been deceived by the enemy. This wasn't God. This can't be God, because, you know, God punishes people forever in hell. I mean, it was a, you know, the fact that this obviously has been in the pipe work for a while, obviously it takes a while to produce a film, shows, you know, what God is doing in society, looking to try and unveil himself and reveal himself. And it was done in a sympathetic way. It didn't sort of cover up, and unfortunately it probably didn't go into the depth of him explaining the scriptures behind it. He tried to sort of almost do it anecdotally, you know, and he was a bit unwise in coming before his congregation without ever saying anything to anyone and telling them that God had told him that hell didn't exist. I built up for it for 12 months before I got to it here. He just blurted it out one Sunday morning. You can imagine the sort of silence that there was. Yeah, but a good film to sort of, again, this process of deconstructing what we think, and, you know, in a reality, you know, which, you know, I mean, praise God, you know, he found his place, and he's doing what he's doing now. But it must have been heartbreak to go through that when your friends turn the back.
Yeah. Well, what I want to do is take everything that's in my basket out and let the basket disintegrate. Now, the question is, how is that done? Apparently, your mindsets or...
Well, I think it'll all be done differently for everybody. You know, for me, it was a very process of deconstruction where it was a series of events, a series of experiences and encounters with God that identified that I had a basket, you know, with all these things in, and then, you know, destroyed the basket and revealed all the things, and then looked to deal with each one of the things that I had over a period of time. I think everyone's journey will be different. It's going with the flow and, you know, being willing and open. You know, God tricked me into it, really, you know. But once I was in it, I went with it, you know, legislate. Oh, I'll legislate for the removal of limitations and restrictions on the mind. Great. Look at all these people who need limitations removed. And God's saying, ha, 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 yay, we got you. You know, and it was just like, well, that was what it was like. You know, I just never really thought that I could have had those limitations and restrictions of my view of him and all my belief systems, but I did. So for me, that was the way he did it. I'm sure he'll do it in different ways with different people. But the key is you can be proactive and you can ask him to do it. That's the key. If I am willing to surrender, I'm willing for you to renew my mind. Search me, O God, and know my heart. Show me if there's anything. You know, use those transformatory type prayer statements, you know, and be willing to go with whichever way he chooses to do it with you, which may well be very different from what he's going to do it with anybody else. But you'll know that you're in the process. You know, he put me in the process, and I'm encouraging people to ask for the process, because when you ask for it, you're already in that point of surrendering to it. Whereas he had to get me to the point of surrender, which was hard.
And I think to a degree, that's where there's the catch-22, because we as a church have become so conditioned to believe that there is a set process here are the 10 steps, and you go through these, and it's the same for everyone. That when you tell people, well, yeah, God will take you through the process, but I have no idea what it's going to look like, and it's probably going to be totally different than what he did for me, then I think that makes a lot of people uncomfortable, because they want to know, well, yeah, but what if I experience something and I'm really not sure? You know, I'd rather know it from your point of view, because then if you got through it and you were okay, well, then your position, that's a workable solution that's going to, and I'm not going to get into trouble, you know, and I'm not going to get off into error, but it's not going to work that way. And to say to people, it's going to be different for you than it was for me, because we're not the same.
No,
it all comes back to the whole trust issue. Are we willing to trust him to take us the way that he seems fit, even though it has a different timetable, a different look, totally different than what anybody else has gone through or will go through?
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, it is. That's the reality of these things. Yeah, we can share testimony and principle of things that happen to us, but everyone's got to go through it themselves in their own way. And I think if you can get people prepared for that up front, then the process will be so much easier for people when they embrace, hey, yes, I know I'm going to have to go through some stuff, but I am embracing it. I'm surrendering to it. I want it. You know, I want my soul and spirit to be totally integrated. I want to be whole. I want to be, you know, the son that he created me to be, you know, and whatever it takes for me to go through to be that. You know, I look at Jesus and I think, okay, yeah, there was his apprenticeship, and yeah, he went through all sorts of different things, and then, there's a few betrayals there going on, and he ended up on the cross. Now, praise God that we've been on the cross with him already, and now we're identifying with his death, burial, resurrection, and ascension. But actually, you know, he's done everything for us. We just have to allow him to outwork it in our lives and be proactive about it, because I think we can accelerate the process if we're proactive rather than resisting. If I'd surrendered on day one, I wouldn't have gone through 6 weeks of, you know, challenge and terrible. I mean, you know, when I look back, what I was like in it, what I was feeling, but I wouldn't have gone through that if I'd surrendered on day one. Yeah, but then, you know, you might as well go through the worst, I guess, and then, you know, everyone else will probably find it a bit better, you know, because they'll probably recognize, oh, yeah, I'm not going to fight this. I'll surrender to it and allow him and stop resisting. Anyway. Okay, right. I better leave there. I got another meeting soon. Anyway.